All right. I'm not good at starting books, like talking about what they are or whatever, but I'm getting ready to start Immanuel Velikovsky's Worlds in Collision. Um, Been wanting to do this book because there's no pictures, so I don't have to worry about scanning it, but there are a lot of footers, so I'll try to get those put in if I can find a good PDF to rip them from. And yeah, I'll put the little subtitles down there. So I'm going to just start this sucker. Preface 1965 to the paperback edition of Worlds in Collision. Wait a minute. Do we want to start with that? Or let's go publishers. I'm going to do the prefaces today. That's it. Publishers preface. Worlds in Collision is a special and extraordinary book, not only by its contents, but also by the response it has received. It is one of the few scientific books of the past centuries that have a direct, profound importance for humanity, individuals, and society alike. In fact, it is a book that puts our present view of the world on a whole new fundament, not in the same abstract, specialized disciplines remote from practical life, but in a broad range of areas like astronomy, cosmology, physics, geology, paleontology, biology, history, archaeology, literature, ethnology, theology, mythology, psychology, and in addition, it has an important influence on the way man sees himself individually and socially. It is the first time in centuries that a scientist didn't choose the direct way to his specialized colleagues in order to make the results of his research known, but addressed himself to the general public in a simple and clear language and presentation, for which he was harshly punished by the scientific establishment. It is exactly this reaction from representatives of the objective sciences that even match some medieval practices, which shows that this book deeply shakes the foundations of our knowledge and belief. Because of this book being so special, it has deeply penetrated the consciousness of many people. Others, however, have preferred to forget it, or at least would like to do so. Due to this purposeful oblivion, a younger generation doesn't even know about it anymore, although today, almost 60 years after its first publication, it hasn't become less of a subject. On the contrary, due to new results of scientific research and recent geological and climatic developments, its importance has even increased. This, too, is something special in the flood of today's short-lived literary and scientific flash in the pans. It is important for everyone of us and for science at large to deal with this book. Therefore, we are happy to take upon ourselves the responsible task of making the complete works of Immanuel Velikovsky, not just this book, available to the public again in its unchanged form. Publishing this book, and this unfortunately also is something special for nonfiction, has required a fair amount of courage, which we proudly and consciously muster up. Paradigma Limited. Preface 1965 to the paperback edition of Worlds in Collision. First published in 1950, this book was left unchanged in all subsequent printings, nor have any textual changes been made in the paper-bound edition. This was so by design. I wish to keep the text in its original form in order that, unaltered, it should face all subsequent discoveries in the fields it covers or touches upon. Should there have been changes, the reader of a new edition would be unable to judge to what extent a book, heretical in 1950, could measure up to later developments. In 1950, it was generally assumed that the fundamentals of science were all known and that only details and decimals were left to fill in. In the same year, a cosmologist, certainly not of a conservative bent of mind, Fred Hoyle, wrote in the conclusion of his book, The Nature of the Universe, "Is it likely that any astonishing new developments are lying in wait for us? Is it possible that the cosmology of 500 years hence will extend as far beyond our present beliefs as our cosmology goes beyond that of Newton?" And he continued, "I doubt whether this will be so. I am prepared to believe that there will be many advances in the detailed understanding of matters that still baffle us. But by and large, I think that our present picture will turn out to bear an approximate resemblance to the cosmologies of the future." And he referred to the limitations of optical means in penetrating the depth of space. The years that have passed since the publication of Worlds in Collision have seen the first great achievements in radio astronomy, the discoveries of the International Geophysical Year, and the dawn of the space age. The picture has changed completely. Signs of recent violence, disruption, and fragmentation have been observed on Earth and elsewhere in the solar system. A submarine gigantic canyon that runs almost twice around the globe, a sign of a global twist, a layer of ash of extraterrestrial origin underlying all oceans, a paleomagnetic evidence that the magnetic poles were suddenly and repeatedly reversed, and it is claimed the terrestrial axis with them, gases escaping from some craters on the moon thought to be cold to its center, and exceedingly high surface heat of Venus. Furthermore, with the discovery of radio signals arriving from Jupiter of the existence of a magnetosphere surrounding the Earth, of the solar plasma, of the net charge of the sun, and of the magnetic field permeating the interplanetary space, decisive evidence has come up that the solar system and the universe in general are not electromagnetically sterile. A basic change in the understanding of the universe, its nature, and the forces active in it. The words found in the preface to the 1950 edition designating the work as a heresy in realms where the names of Newton and Darwin reign supreme should no longer evoke the same spontaneous rejection on the part of even the most conservative in science, unless it is a defense mechanism devised to protect an inner realization of incertitude. What to the scientist constitutes a really satisfactory sort of success for a theory? The answer lies largely in the words generality, elegance, control, and prediction. As to generality, hardly anyone raised an objection. Possibly there was some elegance in the timing. When these words were written in 1960, 10 years after the publication of my book and the great opposition it provoked, some of the most compelling data were radioed by the space vehicle Pioneer 5. I would like to relate here a few details about the control and prediction of two crucial tests decisive for this book. In my work, I came to the understanding that Venus is a newcomer to the planetary family, that it had a stormy, if only short, history, and that it must still be very hot and giving off heat. Further, that it must be surrounded by a very extensive envelope of hydrocarbon, petroleum, gases, and dust. Such claims were in total disagreement with what was known in 1946 when I completed the manuscript of the work, or in 1950 when it was published. To stress the crucial nature of these claims, they were put under the headings "the gases of Venus" and "the thermal balance of Venus," immediately preceding the section, the end. Should I be right in these claims, the entire chain of deductions of which the identification of the extraterrestrial agent of the paroxysms described is but the final ring is strengthened. Damn, let me say that whole sentence over again. To stress the crucial nature of these claims, they were put under the headings "the gases of Venus" and "the thermal balance of Venus," immediately preceding the section "the end." Should I be right in these claims, the entire chain of deductions of which the identification of extraterrestrial agents of the paroxysms described is but the final ring is strengthened. And since these crucial claims were in flagrant discord with accepted values in case of confirmation, they ought not to be denoted as lucky guesses. As late as 1959, Venus ground temperature was calculated to be only 17 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees above the mean annual temperature of the Earth. But by 1961, from the nature of the radio signals emitted by Venus, it was found that Venus ground temperatures is about 315 degrees Celsius or 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. F.D. Drake of the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, responsible for this reading, wrote, "We would have expected a temperature only slightly greater than that of the Earth, and the find was a surprise in a field in which the fewest surprises were expected." There was admittedly no satisfactory explanation of such high temperature of Venus in the frame of the accepted notions. Greenhouse effect could not explain so high a temperature, nor could radioactivity decaying for billions of years. The Mariner 2, the space vehicle that passed Venus in December 1962, was instrumented to detect whether the heat is real and as high as 600 degrees. It found it real and a full 800 degrees. It found also that the night side of Venus is, if anything, hotter than the day side, and that light does not penetrate the cloud cover. It must be gloomy and bleak under this cover. It is stated in the Mariner report by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Very little greenhouse effect could realize itself under such conditions. The other crucial test concerned the gaseous envelope of the planet. In 1946, 4 years before the publication of this book, I directed a request and inquiry to Professor R. Wilt of Yale and the Professor W.S. Adams of Mount Wilson and Palomar Observatories, foremost authorities on the subject of planetary atmosphere, indicating that the presence of hydrocarbon gases and dust in a cloud envelope of Venus would constitute a crucial test for the cosmological concepts evolved from the study of historical sources. Wilt wrote on September 13, 1946, the absorption spectrum of Venus' atmosphere cannot be interpreted as resulting from gaseous hydrocarbons. Adams answered September 9, 1946. There is no evidence of the presence of hydrocarbon gas in the atmosphere of Venus. I must have been completely firm in my belief of not having made a wrong deduction from the first premise of global catastrophe to the last one of identifying the agent to have chosen to print in disregard of the expert opinions. On the basis of this research, I assume that Venus must be rich in petroleum gases. On February 26, 1963, making the results of the Mariner probe, Dr. Homer Newell of NASA announced that in the judgment of those responsible for the part of the program, Venus is enshrouded in an envelope of hydrocarbon gases and dust 15 miles thick, 45 miles above the ground of the planet. It was acknowledged as very puzzling that Venus should have such a massive atmosphere, a score of times heavier than the terrestrial atmosphere, that it should have taken the form of an envelope 45 miles above the surface of the planet, and that it should consist of heavy molecules of hydrocarbon gases and dust. It was also found that Venus rotates retrogradally, though very slowly, a sign of it having been disturbed in its motion in the past, or having been captured by the sun, or having originated in a way different from that of the other planets. At the time of the Mariner probe, two prominent members of the American scientific community, V. Bargmann, professor of physics, Princeton University, and Lloyd Motz, professor of astronomy, Columbia University, wrote a letter to Science, December 21st, 1962, claiming, "For me, the correct prediction of the great heat of Venus, of the radio noises from Jupiter, of the existence of a magnetosphere around the Earth, a paper, some additional examples of correct prognosis written by me, was printed in the September 1963 issue of the American Behavioral Scientist. It contains a survey of various tests, confirmations, and supporting evidence. In that issue, sponsored by a group of eminent men in scholarship and public affairs, is also told the story of reception or rejection of this book, coupled with efforts towards its suppression. It was actually successfully suppressed while in the hands of its first publisher, who had to give it up, though a #1 national bestseller, under the exerted boycott of all this publisher's textbooks by certain groups organized for that purpose in some of the academic councils of the country. Some attempts were made to minimize the value of the crucial tests claimed and confirmations obtained," a prominent astronomer wrote in the December 1963 issue of Harper's. "As to the high temperature of Venus, hot is only a relative term. For example, liquid air is hot relative to liquid helium, whereas I claimed an incandescent state of Venus, page 91, and a gaseous state of all hydrocarbons. Professor H. Hess, chairman of the Space Board of the National Academy of Sciences, volunteered to write me a letter for publication. Some of these predictions were said to be impossible when you made them. All of them were predicted long before proof that they were correct came to hand. Conversely, I do not know of any specific prediction you made that has since proven to be false. If my premises are wrong and only by sheer chance did I obtain such a score, then the theorists of probabilities ought to find out the odds involved. If, as some friendlier skeptics assume, the score is due to an unusual gift of intuition, then I should be accused of sorcery, not only of heresy. However, if the story is a reconstruction of events that took place and of logical implications of them, then the score is but a natural fallout from a single central idea. R. Jurgens. Nevertheless, more efforts were made to disqualify this work, but hardly any astronomical argument of 1950 could be brought profitably against my book in 1964 without denying all the important discoveries of the intervening years. Therefore, attempts were made to evade all these issues and to switch the debate, actually the campaign of depreciation, to questioning my proper use of sources. When a journal printed for physics serves its readers with philological arguments in Egyptology and commits the task to a journalist, uninformed and rash, in the mild appraisal of Professor Moses Makis, and prints a vulgar display of ignorance and distortion, then it is as good as an admission that none of the physical arguments employed earlier could carry weight and no new ones could be devised. It is about such tactics that the student's paper, The Daily Princetonian, wrote editorially, February 1964. While it could have been assumed that anyone challenging the basic premises of Newton and Darwin might be laying himself open to a certain amount of argument, the personal vituperation, deliberate misrepresentation of facts, offhand misquotations, efforts at suppression of the books containing the theories, and the denial of the right to rebut opponents in professional journals that Dr. Velikovsky encountered indicate that far more was going on than mere challenge to established ideas. What the Velikovsky affair made crystal clear is that the theories of science may be held not only for the truth they embody, but because of the vested interest they represent for those who hold them. The deplorable tactics of certain groups in the academia alienated the younger generation, and the historical and physical evidence accumulating with each passing year did not escape their sight, and conclusions were drawn. What was unbelievable and heretical in 1950 is making great inroads into the science that claimed dogmatic completeness and infallibility as recently as then. On the eve of the publication of Worlds in Collision, the philosopher H. Butterfield wrote The Origin of Modern Science, 1949, but the supreme paradox of the scientific revolution is in the fact that things which we find it easy to instill into the boys at school, things which would strike us as the ordinary natural way of looking at the universe, defeated the greatest intellects for centuries. The author, 1965. And now I will read Preface 1950. Worlds in Collision is a book of wars in the celestial sphere that took place in historical times. In these wars, the planet Earth participated too. This book describes two acts of a great drama, one that occurred 34 to 35 centuries ago, in the middle of the second millennium before the present era, the other in the 8th and the beginning of the 7th century before the present era, 26 centuries ago. Accordingly, this volume consists of two parts preceded by a prologue. Harmony or stability in the celestial and terrestrial spheres is the point of departure of the present-day concept of the world as expressed in the celestial mechanics of Newton and the theory of evolution of Darwin. If these two men of science are sacrosanct, this book is a heresy. However, modern physics of atoms and of the quantum theory describe dramatic changes in the microcosm, the atom, the prototype of the solar system, a theory then that envisages not dissimilar events in the macrocosm, the solar system, brings the modern concepts of physics to the celestial sphere. Damn, this book is written for the instructed and uninstructed alike. No formula and no hieroglyphic will stand in the way of those who set out to read it. If occasionally historical evidence does not square with formulated laws, it should be remembered that a law is but a deduction from experience and experiment, and therefore laws must conform with historical facts, not facts with laws. The reader is not asked to accept a theory without question. Rather, he is invited to consider for himself whether he is reading a book of fiction or nonfiction, whether what he is reading is invention or historical fact. On one point alone, not necessarily decisive for the theory of cosmic catastrophism, I borrow credence. I use a synchronical scale of Egyptian and Hebrew histories, which is not orthodox. All right. It was in the spring of 1940 that I came upon the idea that in the days of the Exodus, as evident from many passages of the scriptures, there occurred a great physical catastrophe, and that such an event could serve in determining the time of the Exodus in Egyptian history, or in establishing a synchronical scale for the histories of the peoples concerned. Thus I started Ages in Chaos, a reconstruction of the history of the ancient world from the middle of the second millennium before the present era to the advent of Alexander the Great. Already in the fall of the same year, 1940, I felt that I had acquired an understanding of the real nature and extent of that catastrophe, and for 9 years I worked on both projects, the political and the natural histories, the political and the natural histories. Although Ages in Chaos was finished first in the order of publication, it will follow this work. Worlds in Collision comprises only the last two acts of the cosmic drama. A few earlier acts, one of them known as the Deluge, will be the subject of another volume of natural history. The historical cosmological story of this book is based on the evidence of historical texts of many peoples around the globe, on classical literature, on epics of northern races, on sacred books of the peoples of the Orient and Occident, on traditions of folklore of primitive peoples, on old astronomical inscriptions and charts, on archaeological finds, and also on geological and paleontological material. If cosmic upheavals occurred in the historical past, why does not the human race remember them, and why was it necessary to carry on research to find out about them? I discussed this problem in the section The Collective Amnesia. The task I had to accomplish was not unlike that faced by a psychoanalyst who, out of disassociated memories and dreams, reconstructs a forgotten traumatic experience in the early life of an individual. In an analytical experiment on mankind, historical inscriptions and legendary motifs often play the same role as recollections, infantile memories, and dreams in the analysis of a personality. We can, out of this polymorphous material, establish actual facts. Can we? We shall check one people against another, one inscription against another, epics against charts, geology against legends, until we are able to extract the historical facts. In a few cases, it is impossible to say with certainty whether a record or a tradition refers to one or another catastrophe that took place through the ages. It is also probable that in some traditions, various elements from different ages are fused together. In the final analysis, however, it is not so essential to segregate definitively the records of single world catastrophes. More important, it seems, is to establish one, that there were physical upheavals of a global character in historical times. 2, that these catastrophes were caused by extraterrestrial agents. And 3, that these agents can be identified. There are many implications that follow from these conclusions. I refer to them in the epilogue so that I can omit reference to them here. A few readers went over this book in manuscript and made valuable suggestions and remarks in chronological order of their reading. They are Dr. Horace, there's a lot of people. Dr. Horace M. Callan, formerly Dean of Graduate Faculty of the New School of Social Research, New York. John O'Neill, Science Editor, New York Herald Tribune. James Putnam, Associate Editor, McCullum Company. Clifton Fademan, Literary Critic and Commentator. Gordon A. Atwater, Chairman, Curator, Harlan Planetarium of the American Museum of Natural History, New York. The last two read the work at their own request after Mr. O'Neill had discussed it in an article in the Herald Tribune of August 11, 1946. I am indebted to all of them, but I alone am responsible for content and form. Miss Miriam Kuhn cleared the manuscript of grammatical weeds and helped in reading the proofs. Many an author has dedicated his book to his wife or mentioned her in the preface. I have always felt this was somewhat ostentatious, but now that this work is being published, I feel I shall be most ungrateful if I fail to mention that my wife, Elisheva, spent almost as much time on it at our desk as I did. I dedicate this book to her. The years when Ages in Chaos and Worlds in Collision were written were years of a world catastrophe created by man, a war that was fought on land, on sea, and in air. During that time, man learned how to take apart a few of the bricks of which the universe is built, the atoms of uranium. If one day he should solve the problem of the fission and fusion of the atoms of which the crust of the earth or its water and air are composed, he may perchance, by initiating a chain reaction, take this planet out of the struggle for survival among the members of the celestial sphere. New York, September 1949. The author. Now, I think I'm going to stop there. So, I just wanted to get this started. And I'm not going to do this like I'm doing, I don't know. I might do it. I just wanted to get it in the hopper. That's all I wanted to do. So, have a good one.